Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. We've come far in our narrative. The Pequots are gone, Mayan Tanoma is dead, the English are established, the Puritans are uniting, and Narragansett Bay, all of Rhode Island really, has become the new Connecticut. It's coveted territory. It also lies outside the legal charter of all of the regional colonies. Over the next few weeks, we'll look at how Massachusetts Bay came to dominate or control or influence so much of Rhode Island, even if it was outside their charter and jurisdiction. We'll develop this scenario through the lens of some of their critics and through the lens of their own actions. Let's just say they had a lot of controversy. They had adversaries that were quite up to the task. They were not always popular. And as we'll see, even their like-minded Calvinistic brethren back in England did not always approve of their ways, and in some cases, even overruled them. Even the most notable, Oliver Cromwell, was not too impressed with their conduct. Like Governor John Mason and Ferdinand Gorges before, men did arise that challenged them. Like John Mason and Ferdinand Gorges, these men were much neglected in their lifetimes and much maligned, or worse, smeared in their death, as the Puritans were able to largely frame the history of their times. The primary personality I want to develop is one Samuel Gorton. It was his quarrels with Massachusetts Bay that caused him to move all around the Narragansett Bay, Rhode Island area. It was his quarrels with Massachusetts Bay and his neighbors everywhere that opened the door for Massachusetts Bay to expand its authority into Rhode Island, as they chased Samuel Gorton from one place to another. It was this same Samuel Gorton that secured much of Rhode Island away from Massachusetts Bay. It was this Samuel Gorton that took on the entire New England Puritan establishment and won. He was not destroyed like Anne Hutchinson. He was not neutralized like Roger Williams. He stood up to Massachusetts Bay and won the legal battle. While men like Governor Vane, John Underhill, and Stephen Wheelwright had their lives ruined over the antinomian controversy, Gorton and his followers would persevere and emerge eventually as the victors. It's exciting stuff. A narrative of courage and conviction, steadfastness that we don't see enough of in our own day. We'll also come to understand why he and Roger Williams, so alike in religious views, did not get along. This forgotten man was one of the most pivotal men of his generation, especially in regards to the development of Rhode Island. American evangelicalism often celebrates the Puritans. Yet most, according to the doctrines they profess, would have never made it in Puritan New England. They would have thrived under Samuel Gorton, a man much maligned. If you read his life through the lens of the Puritan magistrates, you would never fully appreciate his contributions. As we'll see, he was not an easy man. Quarrelsome, yes, but not an evil man. He was a fearless and relentless warrior for the cause of freedom of thought and expression, the power of the individual, and the preservation of the inalienable rights of all men. We want to work through Gorton's life pretty quickly. The goal is not a biography of Gorton per se, like we've done in the past for Massasoit or John Underhill or Roger Williams or Anne Hutchinson. Rather, the goal for an overview of Samuel Gorton is to develop the behavior and attitude of Massachusetts Bay as they consolidated power within the New England colonial world. So Samuel Gorton was born in 1593. Records show he was baptized in Manchester, Lancashire, England. He was raised in a relatively prominent merchant's home, and he received, via tutor, a classic education with a focus on language and English law. That education would serve him well in the future. In 1637, he moved his wife and several children from England to Plymouth Plantation, and he served Plymouth during the Pequot War. But it's also where his troubles began. So first off, according to Gorton himself, he came to America because he, quote, yearned for a country where he would be free to worship God according to what the Bible taught him, as God enabled him to understand, end quote. And he would later write, I left my native country to enjoy liberty of conscience, in respect to faith toward God, and for no other end. Okay, so he lands in Plymouth, where he quickly runs into trouble with the magistrates and leaders. He then relocated to Portsmouth, Rhode Island, where, you guessed it, he ran into more trouble with the authorities. It seems he was not the provocateur this time of the initial incident. He had a female servant who had actually accosted a woman, a neighbor, whose cow had wandered onto Gorton's property. When she was summoned to court, he would not let her go. He went to court in her place, and he got belligerent and abusive towards everybody. He called the magistrates just asses. So JUST-ASSES. They were justices, but he called them just asses. I find that oddly sophomoric and yet humorous at the same time. And another man he called a saucy boy and jackanapes. I have no idea what a jackanapes is. So at any rate, his servant woman is supposed to go and be on trial for accosting a neighbor. He goes in her place, he gets belligerent, and he calls the magistrates just asses, and another man a saucy boy and a jackanapes. That didn't get him imprisoned, but it did get him a whipping, and so off he went to Providence. And it was in Providence that he and his followers came to be known as Gortonists, or Gort Knights, or Gort Knights, depending on which book you're reading. For our purposes, we'll call them Gort Knights. So, at any rate, he and Roger Williams, they're living kind of close to each other now, did not get along. They had similar views on the rights of individuals, but Gorton also dismissed the existence of witches and devils. Now remember, these were superstitious times. Gorton was not a superstitious man in that way. He was recorded as saying, quote, "There be no other witches upon earth, nor devils, but your own pastors and ministers, as such as they are," end quote. It is a curious fact that historian Frederick C. Drake pointed out that prior to Salem in 1692, 22 people of New England were executed and numerous others were severely punished in the 95 instances of witchcraft. The Puritan colonies were the only ones to kill anybody. Curiously enough, Rhode Island recorded no cases. So I'm sure his views were not quite as alarming to those folks in Rhode Island as they would have been to the Puritans. At any rate, here in Providence is where the storyline really begins to take shape. Well, Providence and Pawtuxet, a town about 5 miles away, where the Gort Knights would move to. Now at this time, Connecticut threatened to take swift action to secure Narragansett Bay, like they had with Sausages and the Pequots. Massachusetts Bay wanted to move a little slower, a little stealthier. They wanted to take some time to cover their tracks legally, but also work out a way that would enable them to take control. As the United Colonies were forming as a Puritan bloc, Massachusetts Bay bided their time. Everyone was anxious. The folks in Rhode Island were moving in on Narragansett Bay. They were also buying land from Massasoit and the Wampanoags, and this was seen as a threat by Plymouth. Their lands and claims were dependent upon Massasoit's territory. If he relinquished land rights, Plymouth lost land as well, and their safety buffer was eroded. So even if the Puritan colonies were competing, they still needed each other for defense and mutual support against the larger panorama of the several other groups in the region. So Gorton and his group were settled around Providence, and they were not popular. Remember, this whole region was populated without an official charter, at the discretion of the local natives, all of which were beholden or subservient or vulnerable to Mayan Tanoma and the Narragansetts. It was late summer, early fall of 1642. Mayan Tanoma had less than a year to live, and in that time, he would irritate the magistrates. He would be subject to rumors of provoking a native insurrection. He would suffer loss to Uncas and befriend and sell land to Samuel Gorton, all of which led to his assassination in the summer of 1643. Again, we're working through these times in layers, like transparencies, and not always chronological episode to episode. There's just too many moving parts. We need to look at these times, one major event or personality at a time, and then assemble them all together. So last week we looked at Mayan Tanoma and his last days, and now is this second transparency over this larger time frame. We're watching Massachusetts Bay move into the Rhode Island area. At any rate, at this time, some of the Gort Knight neighbors had had enough of the group. They did what probably seemed reasonable at the time. They reached out to a greater power than themselves to help with their problem. They petitioned Massachusetts Bay to come and evict the Gort Knights. They were now living 5 miles south of Providence in Pawtuxet. Men like William Arnold and his son Benedict, and his son-in-law William Carpenter and Robert Cole were aghast at their behavior. And yes, you heard me right, Benedict Arnold, the great-grandfather of the famous or infamous Benedict Arnold of the Revolutionary period. This was at least the second complaint that Massachusetts Bay had received. Roger Williams had complained to John Winthrop previously. Now, he didn't request intervention, but he had complained about Gorton's behavior. At any rate, the request for aid turned out to be a big mistake. Massachusetts Bay turned out in force and stayed for 16 years, treating the locals as subjects, claiming legal jurisdiction, even going so far as to designate magistrates on behalf of Massachusetts Bay. So they prevented Connecticut from moving into the area, and at the same time, under the auspices of helping a neighbor in need, just began controlling the area. Now, this offended Roger Williams because his goal, ultimately, was to unite all of the Rhode Island towns into one regional government. So Massachusetts Bay stymied his efforts as well. I mean, it's all a pretty slick move, isn't it? They cut Connecticut off. They took over a big chunk of land everybody wanted. And they also cut Roger Williams off at the knees. The rumor was that Massachusetts Bay intended to take over the entire territory. And the Gort Knights were scared. Roger Williams wasn't yet, but he would be too by the time this all worked itself out. The rumors were true. If you remember, Anne Hutchinson was paid a visit in Rhode Island by the good magistrates of Massachusetts Bay when they told her that she was not safe in Rhode Island either because they were coming. She relocated to Long Island in 1642 and was subsequently killed by local natives. Anyway, we already covered that in our 2-part series on Anne Hutchinson a few months back. So in October of 1642, Massachusetts Bay issued a warning to Samuel Gorton and his followers. It was delivered by William Arnold, and this is what it said. It's addressed this way: Massachusetts, to our neighbors of Providence. And this is what it says, quote, whereas William Arnold of Pawtuxet, a tract adjoining Providence, and Robert Cole and others have lately put themselves and their families, lands, and estates under the protection and government of this jurisdiction, and have since complained to us that you have since, upon pretense of a late purchase from the Indians, gone about to deprive them of their lawful interest confirmed by 4 years' possession, and otherwise to molest them. We thought good, therefore, to write to you on their behalf, to give you notice, that they and their lands, etc., being under our jurisdiction, we are to maintain them in their lawful rights. If, therefore, you have any just title to anything they possess, you may proceed against them in our court, where you shall have equal justice. But if you shall proceed to any violence, you must not blame us if we shall take a like course to right them. And it was signed by John Winthrop, Governor, Thomas Dudley, Richard Bellingham, and Increase Noel. If you'll notice, this letter is addressed to the neighbors of Providence. The neighbors of Providence. This scared the crap out of Roger Williams. That's a wake-up call. The implications of this correspondence made it clear that nobody was going to escape Massachusetts Bay. Everybody had the potential to be a target. Samuel Gorton fired back a nasty letter, but also heeded the warning and skedaddled to yet another area. This time, in January of 1643, he bought land from Mayan Tanoma and called it Shallamet. Now, this move, as we saw last week, was not popular with the Puritans. In fact, Benedict Arnold predicted that this sale would be the death of Mayan Tanoma, and he was right. This purchase, though it would be contested, and the same land would change hands a few times, did set in motion the series of events that led to Mayan Tanoma's death. but also on a parallel set of tracks, a series of events that would cause Massachusetts Bay to overreach, to grab too quickly and too forcefully. It would lead to petitions in England and intervention. So Shallamet did not go too well either for the Gort Knights. One thing that did occur that would have massive implications in the future was that Roger Williams became so alarmed that he went to England to plead his case for a secure Rhode Island, a Rhode Island free from Massachusetts Bay aggression. Now, he had to sail out of New Netherland because of his ban from Massachusetts Bay. I mean, think about that. After all the service he had rendered them, he was still under threat of death if he returned. I mean, he was friends with John Winthrop. Think about the fear that he must have had in that day and age, travel being what it was, to undertake such a laborious and expensive, not to mention dangerous voyage in the winter. So to say that Roger Williams was very alarmed, and to say he was very alarmed with good reason, is probably an understatement. The United Colonies, there had been a lot of talk about the United Colonies, but they hadn't fully organized yet. But Roger Williams' trip put their organization into overdrive. By late spring, their organization was official, and by September, they would meet for the first time in Hartford. That would be the meeting that sealed Mayan Tanoma's fate. But there's a lot to work through before then. So here's where Massachusetts Bay took the gloves off. The new landlords or enablers of the Gort Knights were two local sachems, Pumham or Pomham, depending on, again, who you read, and another guy named Sakananoko. Sorry if I've said that wrong. Sakananoko. They started out as tributaries of Mayan Tanoma, but Massachusetts Bay would convince them to become their clients, thus giving them a legal argument to molest the Gort Knights. You see what Massachusetts Bay has done, right? So here's another time when the clash of cultures really hurt the native cause. I mean, this was a classic case of cultural misunderstanding. To the sachems, this deal meant little to nothing. They had pledged to Massachusetts their loyalty, their land and their people, but they weren't moving. They were going to continue as usual. So in their minds, they got paid for the land after selling it to one group and then obliged another by pledging the same land to them. I mean, to the natives, this was an internal English problem, not a native problem at all. These types of transactions occurred many times. John Winthrop used this tactic to gain his own personal land at the expense of the town of Concord around the same time frame. Now, Mayan Tanoma accepted the loss of the sachems and the land. He did, however, keep his cut of the original sale. The whole pledge of Pumham was nothing but a show anyways, because 30 years later, he would lead Narragansett forces against the English during King Philip's War. So that's way ahead of ourselves. We'll be there in a few months. Mayan Tanoma was called to Boston and scolded for this event. The magistrates attempted to educate him on Algonquin land laws and rights, as if he had done something wrong and they were in the right. And then they sent him away. In May of 1643, as I said before, the United Colonies officially formed. And one can understand why they had moved so quickly. I mean, look at all the drama and the turmoil going on. Look at all the drama and the turmoil going on that they provoked. They really needed a defensive pact and a way to check each other. The problem was that Massachusetts Bay seemed to be the more sophisticated group when it came to diplomacy and deception. They did, however, miss out on the New Haven area. That was settled by Puritans kind of just passing through Massachusetts Bay before the magistrates could settle it themselves. So that was a loss for Massachusetts Bay. Anyway, by the time September rolled around and the inaugural meeting of the Puritan bloc, they had had enough of Mayan Tanoma and Samuel Gorton. Mayan Tanoma's fate was sealed, as we discussed last week. And 5 days later, the Massachusetts Bay magistrates summoned 10 Gort Knights to Boston to answer for their actions. Now, if you've noticed, as we've gone through this whole saga with Massachusetts Bay and the magistrates, this never goes well for the appearing party. The Gort Knights knew this. It's a setup, right? So they refused to go. I would have too, but I've been a little nervous. I'm not sure if they were, but they should have been. Their response, however, was pitch perfect. I'd like to believe it addressed two things simultaneously. First, it told Massachusetts Bay to stick it. But secondly, it set up a legal argument that could be presented to Parliament later that the Puritans would never be able to win. I mean, the response was simple. The Gort Knights said they wouldn't come. They said, now get this, they recognized only English law. They recognized only the king's government. Clearly, Massachusetts Bay had no authority in Rhode Island and no authority over the king. The king at this time, by the way, was Charles I. He was a man that was detested by the Puritans. His Catholic wife and his debauched parties were such to be the death of England as they knew it. So they thought. So there's really a double insult, isn't there? The Gort Knights refused to come to Boston. They didn't play the game. They didn't allow themselves to be set up that way. And on top of that, they really did chastise and correct Massachusetts Bay. I mean, don't you think you're kind of overstepping? The reality is you have no legal authority here in Rhode Island. And frankly, you're not the government we answer to. It's the king's government that we answer to. And they knew it. But here's a wrinkle. It was 1643 and the Civil War was coming. And the king would soon lose his head. But there would still be a government in England. Actually, a few claims and changing of the guards were about to occur. But any one of these governments or claimants would have been forced to take action against Massachusetts Bay. They were usurping the central government of England. That could not be allowed to stand under any circumstance. I mean, you certainly could not have colonies all over the world, which is what they were building here, a worldwide network of colonies. You couldn't have colonies all over the world begin to act any way they saw fit, in open opposition to established law and protocol. No legitimate government can ever allow this to happen for any length of time, or it will fracture. This was the end of the magistrates' patience, however. They flipped their proverbial lids. They sent notice to Shallamet that they were sending commissioners, George Cook, Edward Johnson, and Humphrey Atherton, along with a militia for their protection. So here's the translation. We are coming to you. We will tell you what you will do, and we will be sufficiently armed for the task. The forced instructions were these. There were four. First, they would subject themselves to Massachusetts Bay. That was flat out treasonous. I mean, even their hardline friends in England would have squashed that notion. Secondly, they would forfeit their lands. Thirdly, they would make satisfaction about a book in which were gross things penned. And I'm assuming that book said negative things about the Puritans. And fourthly, they would pay a very hefty fine. So basically, with threat of death, you will give us all your stuff. You will deny and recant the truth about our actions, about books that you've written. You will leave your homes. Very nice. I mean, I told you they flipped their lids. I told you they overstepped. This was a tyranny they claimed that they wanted to escape when they left England. Frankly, this was a tyranny many of them would never have faced if they stayed in England. It's awful. As the Massachusetts Bay emissaries approached Shallamet, all of Providence was alarmed. It was like an invading army was coming. Even the non-Gort Knights thought this was too far. They also understood the implications for what the future might hold for them. I mean, after all, Rhode Island was a territory full of heretics in the eyes of Massachusetts Bay. I mean, you've got Quakers and Baptists and out-of-line Calvinists. I mean, I admit, I would have been scared for my home and my family and my friends. This is what intolerance looks like. From a distance, removed from the immediate situation, the emotion on either side. It's ugly. It's worse when you realize the senselessness of it. How vulnerable we all really are. The importance of standing for what's right, on principle, even when the guilty party is acting against your position. If you want freedom of thought and expression, you have to be able to extend it to others. The folks of Rhode Island were seeing this concept play out right before their eyes. And these guys were the open-minded guys, right? Yet they complained about the Gort Knights and asked for help. They invited the tyranny and the carnage to come. People, communities, whole societies can fall victim to this kind of short-sightedness if they're not careful. The non-Gort Knights tried to intervene. They encouraged dialogue between the two groups. They offered to be the witness to the talks. But the commissioners would not be denied their task. They offered to appeal the whole thing to England, and again, denied. They offered to get a neutral third party already in the colonies to mediate. Refused. I've learned you cannot pacify someone that's determined to quarrel. In Massachusetts' eyes, they were the law. They had jurisdiction, and they would not reason. They did not want justice. They did not want peace. They wanted revenge. They wanted to inflict damage. They wanted to have it their way, and they were the strongest group around. Forget temperance. There's no consequences for us. We'll do what we want. John Winthrop defended the Massachusetts Bay position by arguing that the very wisest of men had made the decision. No doubt men of God who had their own ambitions. Ambitions tied to the growth and success of Massachusetts Bay. Ambitions shared by the magistrates. Just like the 5 delegates of the United Colonies who had decided the fate of Mayan Tanoma without any consequence. It all just seems dirty to me. So one Sabbath day, and don't forget, these guys were Sabbatarians. That means that you don't do anything on Sunday. One Sabbath, they attacked the Gort Knights, and it was an ugly scene. So I've posited my opinion about this event. I just called it dirty and ugly. Does it sound that way to you? I mean, often the apologists for the Puritan New England group will ignore these events or explain them away because of the times they lived in. And I agree with that position to a point. I do it myself. But I'm sorry, I can't give them a pass on this behavior on neither moral or legal grounds. In the aftermath, a dozen local witnesses signed an affidavit about the events. A dozen people went on the record under oath and signed a legal document of what happened. Apparently, those that were there, people of that time that understood the world they lived in, people not exactly friends with Samuel Gorton and his followers, these folks understood society, its dynamics, and the concepts of right and wrong in their time, acceptable and unacceptable. These folks also thought this was over the top. It did not stop the drama. It did not end the saga. It ignited it. Believe it or not, we may have passed the mid-mark of our story here, but we have not even begun to work through the ramifications. And they would be severe. But all of that's for next time. And until then, I hope our time together this time has really helped the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.